Hello, welcome to Canada CPA Online Academy. As we have been discussing the Canadian auditing standards, CAS, one by one, welcome to the series. And if you have not checked the previous, I would suggest there is a go check and the playlist for CAS and check the individual standards. The intention of this video series is to go through the individual Canadian auditing standards and understand what are the requirements of that standard and how to apply that in a case setting, especially for day two. If you have assurance as your role, it is beneficial if you're able to quote the CAS and the requirements and able to link your case facts with the actual CAS standard requirements, then you achieve the sufficient depth in your role. So today we are going to discuss CAS 230 audit documentation. If you are new here to the channel, please like, share, subscribe to the channel. I upload the CFE preparation tips and videos every week to help you pass your CFE. So moving on to our CAS for today, 230 audit documentation. Now, if you have experience working in an audit firm and you have worked on audits, then this would this is a very, what you can say, for understanding, this is a very simple standard. Uh, what we do usually in our audit processes, it just understanding why things are necessary and how what is the significance of collecting the documentation. That is what this standard talks about. So the requirements are the regulatory part of the standard, and there is always application and other explanatory material that gives, like in the annexures, that is, it is not a mandatory part of the standard. It is just the explanation material. So it sometimes explains with examples what exactly the standard or the requirements mean. So if you are not familiar with some concepts, it is always beneficial to read through the explanatory material to understand the standard in depth. So the scope of this CAS is it deals with the auditor's responsibility to prepare the audit documentation for an audit of the financial statement. Now, the appendix list which CAS requires the specific documentation, because this is the general standard about audit documentation, and then each standard will have a part at the end of the standard about documentation. For example, initial auditing engagement will have one point that you should document. You should document the engagement letter with that audit engagement. For quality assurance, it will have its own documentation. For evidence collection, it will have the para on documentation, how to document your evidence, audit procedures, what is required. So all the other CAS will have one section on documentation. Almost all will have. Now, what are we? What, now, like the previous standard we saw, the 220 quality management of a financial statement audit engagement. Now it requires that a proper quality and standards are followed in an audit engagement for the team as such, and the engagement partner, the signing partner, is responsible for the opinion, but he needs to review all the work that is done. Now, to review, it is required to have some documentation. So that documentation is the evidence that provides that all procedures are followed. What was the evidence collected? What was the discussions that happened with the management? Or what were the issues? How they were resolved? Were there any errors? So all this quality control is followed to arrive at an opinion. And then this documentation provides a supporting to how we arrived at the opinion. Now the auditor has the legal responsibility related to the opinion that is expressed in the auditor's report. So if there is any legal case in a later years, or anything that requires how you arrive at this conclusion, then this documentation will provide that sufficient audit trail and the sufficient procedures were followed that support this conclusion of the audit report. So that is why it is very important to have that documentation in place. And again, as we discussed, it is a teamwork. So to understand what each person is doing, and Suppose there are movements in team, someone leaves the firm, someone moves to a different department. So there should be always an audit file which will give you the history and of the audit and exactly what happened, even if you're not able to contact that person. So that is the intention of audit documentation. Now, what is the nature and purpose of audit documentation? So the main intention is that it meets the requirements of the CAS and the specific document requirements. So the evidence for the auditor's basis for the conclusion, as we discussed, what is the evidence for this, why this conclusion was arrived, and then the evidence that the audit was planned and performed. So all the necessary checks. Suppose there is a fraud that is detected later, and then if there is a question related to the auditor's opinion, how did the auditor did not find this fraud or whatever. So there should be a sufficient trail of evidence that to ensure that the opinion expressed was correct and this was an undetected fraud. But to ensure that this was undetected, there should be a sufficient evidence that proper audit procedures were followed and then nothing was um, arrived at that point of time. Now, then second thing is that it helps to organize and plan the team, like who is handling which part, who is like there is an audit, always there is an audit plan. So what is the plan? So document the plan first. Then next is who is doing which part of the plan, who is supervising the work of the junior auditors, what are the comments by the seniors, were there any issues that were uh, that are significant or can need to be included in the key matter paragraph, or so all that needs to be included. So what is the requirement is, why is it required, is to plan and perform the audit, and then enabling the audit partner to supervise the audit work that it is conducted properly, and then retaining a record of matters containing significance to the future audits, that based on these trends, what is the reference for the future. So all this is required. Now there are some objectives and definition, but here comes the requirements part. So what are the requirements? Very first is timely preparation of audit documentation. So the auditor shall prepare the audit documentation on a timely basis. Now it doesn't mention what is timely basis, but I would say like timely basis is as soon as or along with the audit. Do not trust your memory. So like whenever you're conducting an audit, keep documenting whatever is whatever stage you are in, because sometimes some people are working on multiple audits, sometimes some audits are discontinued in a bit in between, and then they are continued again after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, so something like that. So um, you cannot trust on your memory or to remember what you did or what you observed or what was your uh, notes or thinking line or questions or issues related to that part of the audit procedure. So it is always better to complete the documentation immediately as soon as you're completing your process. Next is what is the form, content, and content and extent of the audit documentation. So the documentation, it should be sufficient to enable an experienced auditor having no previous connection with the audit to understand. Okay, now this is very important. It shouldn't be cryptic, like only the team members who have done that audit would understand what this means. It shouldn't be like that. It should be like suppose another partner, suppose the partner has gone on leave or has left the firm, another partner is taking over the audit and he wants to review what has happened. So it shouldn't be that only the other person would know. It should be a very obvious, and it should have the sufficient notes, what you can say, referencing back and forth. Working papers should be very properly planned to understand an experienced auditor that what's going on in this audit, what are the issues, how, which stage that audit is, what is the plan, how many steps are already covered. So it should be very evident to that third person who is doing the audit. Like, yeah, not logical numbering of the evidence file, initials by the team members, and then what are the discussions that happened. Based on the discussions, what was the conclusion that arrived, what was the conclusion communicated, and all these things should be part of the audit file. Then the auditor shall document the discussions of significant matters with the management. Sometimes it is like just like an oral discussion, like in a meeting, but still after the meeting, there should be some notes that should be prepared, that this was the issue that was discussed, this was the concern that was raised, this was the answer given by the audit committee or the management or those who are charged with the governance. This was the explanation provided. Based on the explanation provided, based on the additional evidence, now it is concluded that, okay, this. So it should be very clear, even if it is discussed in a meeting. Then if there are any departure from the relevant requirements. Now, I have given an example. For example, like last year, due to COVID, all the travel restrictions were there. So maybe in some cases, the location stock audit was not performed. If it's not material, then it doesn't matter that much. But if it is a material stock value of a certain location, what is the and usual procedure is to go and do the stock audit. Then in this case, this is a departure, like the relevant requirements, you departed from your standard audit plan. So what are the alternate procedures that were followed? How did you verify that the value is correct? And things like that, wherever you are taking, because at the planning stage, suppose everything is not like happening as per the plan, it evolves as per the audit situation. So what happened after the plan and what were the changes? So if there are any changes, those should be mentioned or captured in the document, in the audit documentation. Then matters arising after the date of audit report, are they significant matters, and what are the circumstances? And like sometimes you will have to consider whether the conditions existed on the balance sheet date or not. Do we need to revise and things like that? So that is also important part. Then assembly of the audit file. Um, after Okay, this is also important, that after the assembly of the final audit file is completed, auditor shall not delete or discard any audit documentation of any nature before the end of its retention period. So retention period usually is 5 years, and it includes paper and electronic. So the computer for computerized files, or sometimes there are audit software, so any information captured on audit softwares, and actual paper evidence like third-party confirmations and statements and things like that. So everything is included in the audit documentation. It has to be preserved for 5 years. And now you have to ensure that it is stored in a secure facility, because it might contain some sensitive client-specific data, which is shared with you as an auditor, and it should not be leaked or it should not be openly available. So it should be stored securely. That is also important. Now, here is the application and explanatory material, but like very standard. Now, if you have never done an audit or do not have assurance experience, it is good to read through this. Now, usually it is always said that the form content extent of the documentation, what is required. Nowhere it states exactly what needs to be stored as a part of documentation. It always will say that it's based on auditor's professional judgment. So here are some factors. What drives that professional judgment? So what is the size and complexity of that entity? What is the nature of that audit? Are there any significant material misstatements? Then how are you addressing that misstatement? So these factors will impact what you should consider for your documentation. And as we discussed, yeah, everything on paper, electronic file, other media should be covered. And what are the examples they have given, like audit programs, your analysis, if you have done some ratio analysis, some trend analysis, some year-on-year analysis, and things like that. Significant matter, what are the discussions? And then as we discussed, oral explanations, like we discussed, like sometimes some things are discussed in the meetings, but there should be evidence that should be created, or a documentation that should be created after the meeting, which would like a kind of notes of that meeting, which would summarize what was discussed, what was the points raised, and what was the answers, and whatever the discussion, it should be summarized and should be kept as an, because if it's 2 years later, you're not going to remember what was discussed. Okay, you might remember, okay, this was the point that was raised, but you might not remember what was the answers or what were the questions that were provided. So always always it is a good system to make it into a note and save it as a part of the audit file. And then yeah, it mentions the retention period here for 5 years. And here are the specific CAS that requires documentation. So like agreeing to the terms of audit engagement. So you need to have the audit engagement letter saved as your part of your documentation. Quality management, what were the review, what was the discussion, what was the meeting, when was the meeting conducted? All that goes part of the quality management. What is the team? What are the name of the audit team of related to fraud? This would be with specific that that's consideration. So all these CAS would give you the specific requirements that what documentation is required. So that's it for this standard, and hope this is helpful to understand the standard better. From case scenarios, sometimes this is not asked directly or directly relevant to an AO as such, but wherever possible, like in an audit planning memo, you can mention a line that as per CAS 230 audit documentation, you're required to save the audit planning memo or in the part of the working file or something like that. So wherever you can refer wherever a documentation is referred, you can refer back to this standard and mention that as per CAS 230, audit documentation is required for this process or this paper or this procedure, whatever. And that's it. Thank you for your time, and please let me know if you have any questions related to your CFE preparation, if you need any guidance, if you are stuck at some point. And as always, please like, share, subscribe with your friends, with your group, and keep studying. All the best. Thank you.